Today I want to tell you a leadership story. Most of us think of leaders as being public figures who are famous, but my experience tells me that most leaders are actually not famous and they do most of their work outside of the spotlight. This story is personal to me and it starts way back in the 1960s. So in the later half of the 1960s, my family actually moved from the United States down to South America, to the country of Venezuela. My father was working in the oil industry, and he was part of the many foreign workers at the time who were helping to develop Venezuela's oil industry. For those of you who don't have the background, Venezuela sits on the largest proven reserves of oil in the world, and so they are very rich in natural resources. It's kind of ironic then that over the last 20 years, Venezuela has actually slid down a steep slope into poverty, and things are really in a bad shape. And so many people from Venezuela have actually left the country, fled it as refugees, economic refugees over the last couple of years, millions in fact. And our story begins last year, 2019, in September, when a man named Orlando Pimentel left Venezuela and went to Ecuador. Just a real quick geography lesson here. This is South America. Ecuador is here on the west coast of the continent. Venezuela is up here on the north coast. And the distance between these two countries is about 1,200, 1,300 miles, or about 2,000 kilometers. Orlando's background is kind of interesting. He was experienced working for the government as someone investigating and documenting corruption in the government. And his job was basically to collect all the facts and the data about corrupt officials. And he did his job very well, working with his team. The only problem is the prosecutors never took the cases to court. And so he got a little frustrated in his job where year after year he was documenting all these cases of corruption and then nothing was being done with it. Well, fast forward, last year, 2019, the economic situation was so bad in Venezuela, he needed to flee the country in order to be able to just work and earn some money for his family. He landed in Ecuador and in a job where he was basically a lumberjack. He was helping to cut down trees. The work wasn't glamorous, obviously, and it wasn't paying a lot, but the economic situation was such that he got 3 meals a day, and he was making enough money to send it back to his family and support them in Venezuela. Here's where the story has a little bit of a twist, because Orlando was ambitious and he wanted to improve his situation, and so he decided to invest in a food cart. He was working on the outskirts of Ecuador's second largest city called Guayaquil. It's on the coast. It's the major seaport, in fact. And he invested in a food cart. He decided to sell food to people on the street, and things were starting to look good. And then March of this year, the epidemic hit. Ecuador, especially Guayaquil, it became the epicenter for COVID cases. Everything shut down in the city. People were dying. It was overwhelming. The morgues, the funeral homes, people were literally just putting the bodies of their own relatives out on the streets. And he just realized things are really bad here. I mean, they're bad in Venezuela, but they've gotten just as bad here. I'd be better off going back home, because he wasn't making any money and he was in a far off country away from family. And so Orlando decided, I'm going to head back home. The only problem is the international borders were closed down. There's another country in between as well, Colombia. So that require crossing at least 2 international borders. Orlando, being the man he is, did not want to simply make the trek home by himself. He said, how can I get as many of my countrymen home along with me? And so he tried to organize a group, and he said, we have strength in numbers. Maybe we'll get the attention of our own government or some non-government body that will help us. He knew that it was perilous, the situation that they were in. So first of all, they all got together and he wrote letters to his own government in Venezuela, to the United Nations, to the Ecuadorian authorities, to everyone that he could think of. And it came to nothing. No one paid attention. No response came back. And as the days turned into weeks, he finally said, you know, we've got to do something about this. It's probably our worst option, but it's the only option we've got. We can at least walk back to Venezuela. 1,300 miles walking back. There's a little problem. Guayaquil, as I mentioned, is on the coast, so it's virtually at sea level. And between Guayaquil and Venezuela is the Andes Mountains. And so they would have to climb over the Andes Mountains, going through mountain passes, going through the jungles, being under the elements, being in rain, all sorts of difficult situations. Besides the elements, they've also got hostile people in every town that they would stop in who didn't really like their presence, these refugees. There were a lot of dangers in this trip. The group finally, though, decided we have no other good options. We've got to do something. And so they took out walking on foot. They eventually made it to the capital of Ecuador, to Quito, which is about 250 miles away, or 400 kilometers. It's also 9,000 feet elevation, where they eventually got into a shelter. And there were 17,000 refugees in Ecuador. No one is coming to rescue us. And so they headed toward the border. And so going up from Ecuador toward Colombia, they decided we've got to make a run for it. And so as they went from Guayaquil they were in Quito, they headed to the border. Well, as I mentioned earlier, the international border was closed. So once they made it to the border, they had to pool their resources, which were very slim. They had to hire coyotes, which is the term for professional smugglers, people who knew the way to get them over the border. And in this particular place, it means in very dangerous mountain, passes at night, slippery slopes, literally, and you had to spend all your money on it. And that's what happened to them. They got across the border into Ipiales, Colombia. Orlando continued to send messages through his phone back home and also to coordinate things with the group. This wasn't an official position. This wasn't something that anyone appointed him to. It was just, he decided people needed help and he was determined to get everyone home safely. Some people in the group just struck out and went ahead on their own, and so people started going off in different directions. The strength in numbers philosophy didn't actually turn out so well. And so it eventually got to a point where Orlando's attention was on him taking care of people and being the one in charge as much as possible. And it got to a point where there were just 5 people left. Orlando and 4 others in his group. And at this point, no resources left. Orlando got in touch with some of the people who'd made it back home. And they said, hey, you were such a helpful member of our group. You were a leader. And they put together money to pay for the bus ticket so that he could come back as well. Most of us would have just jumped at the opportunity. Orlando, however, said, could you raise a little more money so that all of our group, the other 4 people, could get back as well? He was thinking like a leader, not putting himself first. In fact, he was behaving like the captain of a ship. I'll be the last one off this ship. I'll make sure everyone gets off safely. And in fact, that's what happened, is that they were able to raise money for everyone to get a bus ticket to get home out of the goodness of other people who were not wealthy, who were poor, but pooling their resources helped one another out. And so the happy ending of the story is, at the end, Orlando and all the people in his group made it back to Venezuela safely. Now, I tell you this story because I think it illustrates some really important things about leadership. Orlando was a leader. He was that already, even when he was in difficult circumstances, when he had to leave his own country and find new opportunities to support his family. He humbled himself. He took on a job that was, below him. He was much more qualified, but this is what he needed to do. That shows character. That shows leadership. And when things got so bad that there were no other good options, he decided not just to go home, but also to organize the group so that as many of his countrymen could join him and have safe passage back home. And so as a leader, he took initiative. He worked to look out for other people. It wasn't about himself. There was a bigger mission. There was a bigger cause that he was working for. And that inspires me. That inspires all of us when we see someone else acting selflessly and taking the heat themselves personally so that others can have a little better quality of life. We often look for the big companies or our government to bail us out, to come to our aid. We're much better off, I believe, if we take local action and initiative and get people together. We can make things happen together. But that takes leadership, and it's often out of the limelight, and it's not something that a famous person is going to step forward and do for us. We have to do it ourselves. I hope you found this story inspiring as much as I have. I've enjoyed sharing it with you. I don't think you would have heard of Orlando Pimentel any other way besides watching this video and hearing this story. And so I'm glad to share it with you. If you like content like this, I invite you to subscribe to my channel, where we talk about leadership principles and stories to inspire and help us grow in our own leadership. Thanks for watching.